Have you ever thought about that weird moment when you wake up from a deep sleep? Like, 1 second, you're basically gone, out like a light, maybe dreaming, maybe it's nothingness.
Yeah.
And then, bam, you're back. Fully you. You remember who you are, where you are, what day it is, all that stuff. And it's so instant, so smooth. Like, how does that even happen?
It really is incredible when you think about it. It's like your personal you-ness just vanishes for a while and then reappears, fully loaded. All your memories, your self-awareness, everything. It's something we all experience all the time, but rarely stop to really think about it deeply.
Right, like it's just there. So today we're going deep on this whole coming back to you thing.
Oh, cool.
We're diving into Antonio Damasio's book, Self Comes to Mind, Constructing the Conscious Brain.
Okay. I'm familiar with Damasio.
Yeah, he's a fascinating guy. And in this book, he's basically trying to figure out how your brain actually builds that feeling of being you, that inner you that's always there.
It's a big one.
Huge, right. Like, how does the brain, which is this biological organ, create something as complex and intangible as the mind? And then, on top of that, how does it create...
It's a miracle when you think about it.
Totally. And as Damasio points out, it's not just that it's mysterious, it's also like the most fundamental thing about our existence, right? We are conscious beings. We experience the world subjectively. And it's always accessible to us. We're doing it right now.
That's right, happening all the time.
But it's so easy to overlook. Like, we don't spend our days pondering the miracle of being aware.
Nope.
Kind of like gravity. It's always there, always acting on us, but we don't usually go around thinking, whoa, gravity.
You'd think we would, though, right?
Yeah, you'd think. Anyway, we're using Damasio's book as our roadmap for this deep dive. We're going to try to understand the biological roots of your sense of self, that core feeling of I-ness that makes you, and how that connects to consciousness.
Should be interesting.
Totally. And our mission here is to break down Damasio's key insights in a way that makes sense. We want you to come away with a deeper appreciation for what it means to be a conscious human being.
Right, but without getting too lost in the weeds.
Exactly. We want this to be enjoyable, not a brain-melting exercise.
Some of this stuff can get pretty complex, though, right?
It can. So let's dive in. One of Damasio's central ideas, and it's a big one, is that consciousness isn't just something the brain does automatically.
Okay. Like, it's not just a default setting.
Right. He argues that consciousness happens when the brain adds specific processes related to the self to its basic mental activity.
Interesting. So, like, without this self stuff, no consciousness.
Exactly. Without a sense of self, there's no conscious awareness in the way that we understand it.
Okay, I'm following.
Think about those times when your sense of self kind of disappears.
Like when?
Well, like when you're in a really deep sleep under anesthesia or, sadly, sometimes due to certain neurological conditions. In those states, your conscious experience, your feeling of being you, just vanishes.
That makes sense.
Right. It's pretty wild to think about.
It is. But then the question becomes, what exactly is this self thing that's so essential?
Exactly. Damasio digs into this. He talks about William James, another big thinker in psychology who had some really insightful ideas about the self, but also acknowledged that it's super hard to define. Like, what is it really?
It's slippery.
Yeah.
Right.
And Damasio builds on James's work, arguing that the self isn't some fixed thing. It's not like an object you possess. Instead, it's a constant dynamic process. And this self process is always running in the background whenever we're conscious.
Okay, so it's more like a verb than a noun.
Exactly, like selfing instead of just self.
I like that.
And he looks at this self process from two angles, which I found really helpful. First, there's the self as the observer. This is the part of you that's constantly taking in information about your internal world.
Internal world. So, like, what kinds of things?
Your thoughts, your feelings, your memories, your actions, your entire personal history, all of that. It's like the self is observing this constantly changing stream of information that makes up your mental experience.
Makes sense. Like, it's the witness to your own internal movie.
Exactly. And the second perspective is the self as the knower. This is the part of you that brings focus and attention to your experiences.
Okay.
It's what makes you feel like your thoughts and feelings are actually yours, that they belong to you. It's what allows you to step back and reflect on your experiences and say, this is happening to me.
So the observer takes it all in, and the knower makes it personal.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
And Damasio suggests that these two perspectives on the self are actually connected to our evolutionary history.
Oh, interesting. How so?
He thinks that the self as knower, that reflective I part of us, actually evolved from the more basic self as object.
So like a gradual development over time.
Exactly. It wasn't just a sudden leap, but a slow evolution of more complex self-awareness.
Makes sense.
And this self-process, whether it's the observer or the knower aspect, can operate at different levels of intensity.
Okay.
Sometimes it's very subtle, just a basic feeling of being present in your body. Other times it's super strong, like when you're really aware of your own unique identity.
I can relate to that. Sometimes I'm barely aware that I have a body, and other times I'm hyper-aware of every sensation.
Right. And Damasio has this beautiful way of putting it. He says, you sometimes realize it, sometimes you don't, but you always feel it. That underlying sense of being alive and present.
I like that.
He also discusses William James's concept of the material me, which I found really fascinating. It's basically everything that you consider to be part of you.
So like more than just my body.
Right. It goes way beyond that. It includes your possessions, your loved ones, your home, your reputation, your work, all of it.
Basically my whole world, all the stuff I care about.
Exactly. It's like your extended sense of self in the world. And then Damasio brings in these concepts of feelings of knowing and somatic markers, which are basically ways that your brain tags information as relevant to you.
Wait, somatic markers? What are those?
Think of them like little emotional flags that pop up in your mind and say, hey, pay attention to this. It's important to you.
Okay, so they help us filter out what's relevant to us.
Right. And he defines the material self, or what he calls the proto-self, as this constantly changing collection of brain processes that are centered around your physical body.
So like the proto-self is like the brain's map of the body.
Exactly. It's a representation of your body's internal state, a kind of core you.
And this is where the somatic markers come in.
Right. They help distinguish what's you from what's not you in that constant flow of information.
Got it.
And then there's the subject self, or the I, which is the part of you that's aware of yourself as a subject, as the experiencer.
And how's that different from the proto-self?
Well, the proto-self is more basic, more rooted in the body. The subject self is more abstract, more about your sense of self as a knower, a thinker, an experiencer. And Damasio points out that this I is a bit more elusive, harder to pin down.
It's kind of like it's in the background most of the time.
Right, but it's still essential for consciousness.
Okay, so we've got the self, but how does that actually lead to consciousness?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And Damasio argues that consciousness isn't just about having a bunch of images or thoughts floating around in your mind.
So it's more than that.
Right. He says that it's about how those images are organized, and that organization is centered around you, the living being that's experiencing them.
So there needs to be a you at the center of it all.
Exactly. He says that simply having organized mental content makes a mind, but to have a conscious mind, you need that extra ingredient, the self. The self is what transforms a collection of mental images into a subjective experience.
That's a cool way to think about it.
It is, right. And the key here is that consciousness requires the brain to develop what he calls subjectivity.
Subjectivity.
Yeah, it's that feeling that your thoughts, your feelings, your perceptions, they're all yours. They belong to you, the single, enclosed being.
So subjectivity is like the feeling of ownership over your experiences.
Exactly. Without that, it's just data, just information. But with subjectivity, it becomes your experience.
Right.
And Damasio outlines a kind of three-stage progression of how this knower develops.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more.
He starts with the proto-self, that basic bodily self we talked about, and those primordial feelings that come from it.
Right. So the proto-self is like the foundation.
Exactly. Then comes the core self, which is all about your actions in the world. It's about the relationship between you, the organism, and the things around you.
So like when I reach for my coffee cup, that's my core self interacting with the world.
Precisely. That basic act of reaching and grasping, your brain making sense of your body moving in relation to the cup, that's the core self in action. And then there's the autobiographical self, which is the most complex level. This is the self that's built on your memories, your history, your plans for the future. It's the story of your life.
It's all coming together.
Yeah, and Damasio makes it clear that these aren't like rigid categories. They all blend together and influence each other.
Makes sense.
Okay, so now he introduces this idea of the witness self.
The witness self.
It's that part of you that can observe your own mental activity. Like, there's a part of you that can step back and watch your thoughts and feelings as they happen.
Whoa, that's trippy, like metacognition.
Totally. And he points out that our whole understanding of the mind is tied to this witness self. Without it, we wouldn't even know we had minds.
Right.
But there's also a potential problem here.
Oh, what's that?
We're relying on the self to try and understand the mind, but the self itself might be biased. Like, our intuitive sense of self could be misleading.
Okay, how so?
Well, it might make us think that the mind is something separate from the body, like some kind of ghost in the machine. But Damasio argues that the mind is deeply rooted in the body. It's not some separate entity.
I mean, that makes sense, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And this misconception can lead to some weird explanations for consciousness. Like, some people try to connect it to things like quantum mechanics.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Right. But Damasio's point is, let's stick to what we can actually study and understand scientifically before we go down those rabbit holes.
Keep it grounded.
Exactly. He also challenges the idea that our mental activity is somehow non-physical.
Okay.
Yeah.
It does feel kind of intangible, right?
Totally. But he points out that we've been wrong about this kind of stuff before. Like, people used to think the Earth was the center of the universe or that the heart was the seat of the mind.
Oh, right.
Our intuitions aren't always right.
Good point.
So Damasio suggests that we need to take a more multifaceted approach to understanding consciousness.
What does he mean by that?
He says that relying solely on introspection, just looking inward at your own experiences, isn't enough.
Right. We need more than that.
Exactly. And just observing outward behavior isn't enough either. And even brain scans, while they're super helpful, can only tell us so much.
Each of those things is just one piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. So he proposes adding a fourth perspective to the mix.
Which is?
Evolutionary biology and neurobiology. He argues that we need to trace the origins of self and consciousness back through the history of life.
So, like, go all the way back to the beginning.
Pretty much. Start with the simplest organisms and see how the nervous system evolved over time.
And see what that tells us about how consciousness developed.
Exactly. And a key assumption here is that mental events are ultimately linked to specific events in the brain.
The brain-mind connection.
Right. And Damasio suggests that when you have a sufficiently rich self-process, those brain events can become known by you.
Known.
Yeah, like experienced consciously.
Yeah.
But without that self-process, those events just happen without any subjective awareness.
Oh, I see. So the self is what makes those brain events into conscious experiences.
Precisely. And he's careful to say that this isn't about reducing the mind to just the brain.
Right. It's more nuanced than that.
Exactly. He acknowledges that the brain is incredibly complex. It's not just a simple equation. But he's arguing that the mind arises from those complex brain processes.
Okay, that makes sense.
And he points out that tons of organisms have had minds throughout evolutionary history, but consciousness, in the sense of having a self that's aware of itself, that's a more recent development, and language has played a big role in that.
So language helps us solidify our sense of self.
Exactly. It allows us to think and talk about ourselves in more abstract ways, which strengthens our conscious awareness.
Cool.
Okay, so now we get to one of the most important parts of Damasio's framework, the idea that the body is the foundation of consciousness.
Interesting. Tell me more.
He says that our brains are constantly mapping our bodily functions, and those maps become the raw material for our minds.
Okay.
Like, your brain is always monitoring what's going on in your body.
Temperature, heart rate, all that stuff.
Exactly. And those signals get translated into mental images. And this leads to his concept of the proto-self, which is a specific type of body-mind representation that arises in certain parts of the brain, mainly the brainstem.
The brainstem, that's a pretty primitive part of the brain, right?
Totally. We share it with lots of other animals. And Damasio emphasizes that these brainstem structures aren't just connected to the body, they're actively attached to it.
So, like, they're in constant communication.
Exactly. There's a constant flow of signals back and forth. And this makes bodily representations super important in the brain.
Okay.
And from the proto-self come these things called primordial feelings.
Primordial feelings.
Yeah, these are like the most basic, fundamental feelings we have. They reflect the body's current state, like whether things are good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant.
So they're like the building blocks of all our other emotions.
Exactly. And they originate in the brainstem, not the cortex, which is where more complex emotions happen.
Okay, that makes sense.
So Damasio outlines these stages of self-construction, starting with the proto-self and those primordial feelings. Then comes the core self, which is about your actions and interactions with the world. And finally, the autobiographical self, which is all about your personal history and narrative.
There's a gradual buildup of complexity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the proto-self and the core self together make up what William James called the material me, that basic sense of your physical being. And the higher levels of the autobiographical self contribute to what James called the social me and the spiritual me.
Our sense of self in relation to others and our beliefs about the world.
Exactly. And both the core and autobiographical selves contribute to that feeling of being the knower, the I.
Got it.
Okay, so now let's talk about where consciousness happens in the brain.
Right.
It's important to move away from this idea that there's a single consciousness center.
Yeah, I've heard that. Like, it's not just one spot.
Right. Damasio argues that consciousness emerges from the coordinated activity of multiple brain regions working together.
Like a team effort.
Exactly. And the key players are parts of the brainstem, the thalamus, and the cortex. It's a whole network.
And these different parts are all communicating with each other.
Constantly. And he compares it to an orchestra. Like, consciousness isn't produced by a single musician or instrument. It's the whole orchestra working together that creates the music.
That's a great analogy.
Right. And he makes this really interesting point that the conductor, which represents the self, actually emerges as the orchestra is playing.
Wait, so the self isn't directing the show from the start?
Exactly. It arises out of the coordinated activity of the brain.
That's wild.
It is, right. But it doesn't mean the self is any less real. It's just that it's a product of this complex, interconnected activity. And this coordination starts at a basic level with the core self, those simple interactions with the world. And then it gets more complex as more brain regions get involved in processing memories, planning, and social interactions.
Makes sense.
So we've got consciousness, but what's it actually for? Like, why did it evolve?
Good question.
Damasio suggests that it's all about efficiently managing and protecting life. But he also points out that life-regulating mechanisms existed way before consciousness. Even single-celled organisms do it.
Right, it's fundamental to life.
Exactly. And this brings us to the concept of biological value. It's basically what's good or bad for an organism's survival. And this idea has shaped the brain's evolution big time. It's tied to reward and punishment, social emotions, and even complex reasoning.
So consciousness evolved to help us better manage our survival.
Exactly. Damasio sees it as emerging from this long history of life regulation, this constant process of maintaining internal balance that we call homeostasis.
Trying to stay alive and well.
Right. And he thinks that primordial feelings, those basic good-bad feelings, might have been an early form of sentience, which eventually led to more complex selves and consciousness.
Interesting.
So as brains evolved and became more complex, especially in primates, this self-process expanded.
Okay.
The autobiographical self, with its vast storehouse of memories, developed and started interacting with the core self.
And this led to what, exactly?
It allowed us to start understanding and predicting the thoughts and feelings of others. And this led to the development of culture.
Culture, what?
Yeah. We started creating tools and systems to regulate our lives, not just individually, but also as a society.
Things like laws, governments, art, medicine.
All of that. And Damasio emphasizes that both basic homeostasis and these more complex sociocultural mechanisms are ultimately about protecting life.
They just operate at different levels.
Right? So to sum it all up, your conscious self, that feeling of being you, isn't just there from the start. It's constructed. It's built from your interactions with the world, your bodily experiences, your memories, and your social life. It's a product of evolution, a way to better manage and protect life.
Wow.
Pretty amazing, right? And understanding this, the biological basis of consciousness, has some big implications for how we think about ourselves and the world.
Definitely.
It can help us be more rational, more compassionate, and maybe even make better decisions about the future.
I like that.
Me too.
Yeah.
And it raises some really interesting questions about what it means to be human.
Absolutely. Like, how does this understanding of consciousness affect our ethics, our views on technology, our whole sense of who we are in the universe?
Huge questions. And as Damasio says, understanding consciousness isn't just about understanding the brain. It's about understanding the value of life.
Profound stuff.
It is. So keep exploring these questions, folks. It's a wild ride.